Thanks for taking the opportunity to listen to this podcast. We're now after hours for our masterclass, and we've had the privilege of having Joel Thiessen with us from Ambrose University. Joel, thank you for sharing with us on the masterclass, and we're really excited now to maybe go a little bit deeper. And joining us in the conversation is Colin Cook, Dan Pike, Laura Bennett, and Natasha Davidson. So thank you to you four as well for joining us in this conversation. Joel, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask just a question of Colin and Dan and Laura and Natasha and give you the opportunity to respond to that. But the first question for those who are going to ask the question really is, what did Joel say today that caught you by surprise or caught you off guard and made you go, oh, I hadn't even thought of that. And that's something to ponder. And so, Natasha, I'm going to start with you, and we'll go on from there.
Yeah, I really enjoyed today's conversation. And one of the things I guess maybe didn't necessarily surprise me, but reminded me, I would say, is the major social concerns diminished in the pandemic. So things that people may have thought were a bigger concern to them pre-pandemic really were not the sole focus during the pandemic. And that was just a really good reminder that, this has changed our focuses a lot of times.
Yeah, Joel, could you take us a little bit deeper with that? Maybe just, and maybe just to follow up on Natasha's question, what are some of those key areas that you see getting pushed to the background and other areas that are being drawn to the front?
Yeah, happy to. Thanks for your reflection there, Natasha. It's a reminder for us that our social concerns are not necessarily constant, but that our social concerns are framed by the narratives that we hear in the social environments around us. So the media is a really great example. We know that the more that the media talks about a particular topic and the ways in which it frames particular topics, whether it's something that is something that we ought to be fearful of or encouraged by, etc., that this shapes people's perceptions and experiences. And so our social concerns in many respects, and this is heightened due to social media as well, it ebbs and flows, it rises and falls based on what we see and hear within the media. So the pandemic's a great example that because this is so front and center, the other things that were concerning to people at a social level is kind of faded into the background as things like COVID and the economy, for example, becomes more concerning for some, mental health. And we saw that as three of the leading prevailing concerns, while other things might fade in the background. So as different social things occur, things related to racism, for example, and you'll see protests, and this becomes more social concerning for a period of time, and it won't last forever. It will fade as we hear both media and teachers and religious organizations and parents talk about. So yeah, our social concerns, they ebb and flow based on the social environment and how much attention is given to some things versus others.
Colin, what about you? What kind of surprised you or caught you off guard?
I guess the one thing that really kind of stood out in that way was kind of connecting two different points of your talk, which was the importance of choices to millennials, but that very availability of choices that are out there today can cause regret and just stress within the individual as they look back on choices they've made. So really appreciated your going into the mentoring that can help in that process. But I wonder if you could just maybe dive just a little deeper on that in terms of how in a culture that values that choice so much, and heaven forbid if you remove a choice from them, today, but yet that very aspect is part of what causes perhaps even some mental health issues and stress and regret in life for them.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots more I could say here, but it in part, it comes down to even parenting approaches and strategies. There's been a shift in sociology of family as an area of research that looks at how parents used to, in previous generations, I mean, they were the authority figures. They were the ones in power. They told their children how it was going to work. And what we've seen over the course of time is as parents themselves have come to value choice as part of an individualist society, have passed that on to children at a younger and younger age, almost to the extreme where children have more power than parents do in that parent-child dynamic, where the choice has been handed over to children. And one of the consequences of that is that parents have passed on the choice in kind of an unfettered way that hasn't helped children from a young age on what it means to make a good choice or decision. So you get your first time part-time job or something, and how should Johnny or Susie spend that money? Well, it's your money, Johnny and Susie, so you go spend it how you want, is a very different narrative than just so you know, Johnny and Susie, that if you spend your money in this way, this is one of the implications. Or if you save it in this way, it might help you when you're thinking ahead to university or those kinds of things. And so that narrative, that approach to both providing choice, which isn't inherently a bad thing, but along with that, helping to socialize and train young people on how to discern well within that narrative, I think is really important. And this has a ripple effect in society at large, because at its fullest extent, now you have this sense of, I can be any gender I want, any sexuality I want, any race I want, and you can follow that whole train of thought. And there is a sense that, and I don't mean to be disparaging here, but there's a sense that it's almost in vogue to be anything you want for a time and place, and that might change over the course of time. And that potentially can have dangerous consequences for individuals when they come to the age where they're starting to put all these pieces together, and they've made all these choices without a set of parameters on how to discern well. And in some ways, that's actually the fault of older people within a young person's life who have set them up for failure in some respect. And so this is a great opportunity for parents and teachers and youth leaders to actually help children navigate the cacophony of voices and choices along the way.
Laura.
Yeah, thanks so much again, Joel, for this conversation. This is great. I think one thing that really kind of, again, like Natasha, not necessarily surprised me, but it was a good reminder. It's just that you're seeing, the increases, some of the increases in church involvement and the younger generations that are staying in the faith is actually being driven by immigration and people coming from the global south. And it makes me think of, some other research and some leaders that I've heard saying a lot about just the explosion of the church in the global south right now, and what that sort of migration can mean for the future of the church in Canada. So I'd just love for you to kind of expand on, what does that mean for our churches? What does that mean for our next generation ministries?
Yeah, great question. Churches need to pay attention to immigration, race, ethnicity, for many reasons, but one of them is this is where the church in Canada is heading. It's actually the primary thing that is providing sustenance, life, vitality to local churches. And I think a church's ability, in fact, I would say a denomination's ability to pay attention to its systems and structures for inclusion of different racial and ethnic groups, different regions of the world is very important because that will directly connect to the ways in which we can pass the faith on well from one generation to the next. So if you're in Atlantic Canada and you've immigrated from Sierra Leone, or you come from Thailand, or you've come from Brazil, or what have you. There are all kinds of cultural and social and familial dynamics that are in play, along with the ways in which religion was practiced and presented within one's country of origin. And for churches to give attention to that in very careful and systematic ways. So just to make this really concrete, who's in church leadership? And does that capture racial and ethnic diversity from different regions of the world, whether it's in paid positions, whether it's our board or elders, whether it's our ministry leaders? When we think about youth ministry in particular, who's leading those groups. We know that there's an affinity for those, not just in youth ministry, but church ministry overall, to leaders who we think are like us, whether it's race, ethnicity, social class, etc. And so seeing ourselves, broadly speaking, reflected on the platform and those who are designing ministry opportunities, who are hanging out and engaging within discipleship ministry with young people, all of those things can actually help to build bridges. And I think if we can create that kind of atmosphere, it also helps with that idea of keychain leadership, that you'll actually see people step into roles of leadership from different regions of the world who are now part of this local congregation that provides all kinds of beautiful opportunities, I think, for individuals and for churches to really flourish. But it is a changed way of thinking for some, particularly within kind of the dominant majority in a local context, that will have to reframe and alter, that this is, to use a hockey metaphor, this is where the puck is going. And if you want to be there when the puck is there, we need to anticipate that. And frankly, the puck's already there in some contexts, and we need to be moving in that direction.
That's so good. Dan.
Yeah, thanks again, Joel. Just there's a number of things that stuck out to me as you were talking, and I wrote down some quotes and stuff. But one of the pieces I wrote down, something along the lines like, if you're in a position of leadership and unwilling to hand off the keys, it's the first sign that you shouldn't be in a position of leadership. And that just really, I guess, just resonated with me deeply as I look at across our churches, and I see the opportunities especially for youth and young adults to be leading. But a lot of those opportunities are not being met in our churches. And we'd just love to have you maybe expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah. Sometimes, not all the times, but sometimes those who are in positions of power or leadership get quite accustomed to doing things the way they want to do things, have a degree of control and ensuring that things are done the ways that they want to. And so I think sometimes it's a position of fear for those who are in leadership that, well, what might happen if I pass the keys over? And so I think it's helpful to just ask the question, like, what is the worst thing that could happen? If this young person were to take leadership in this area, what's the worst thing that can happen? And so I attended an event one time, and someone was talking about having children lead the offering time of their church, so that the children would actually walk with the baskets up and down the aisles and pass it down and collect that as their meaningful attempt towards intergenerational ministry where children would be involved. And they said, okay, well, what's the worst thing that could happen? He said, well, probably if they dropped the basket and all the money went everywhere, right? And he said, the way in which your church would respond if that were to happen will tell you a lot about how your church thinks about intergenerational ministry, leadership development, and so forth. And so at a much broader level now, what's the worst that can happen if we don't share leadership with young people? Well, the worst thing that could happen, and is quite possible, is your church might not be here in a generation or two, right? So the question that we heard during the session of sort of an older demographic and bringing on young people, et cetera, like this can be a very difficult scenario for some. I think about my own youth growing up experience. A teenager, I'm a drummer. Played in a band. We wanted to lead worship on a Sunday morning, and our church allowed us to do that. And I have no doubt that the music was probably too loud, that the lyrics were probably theologically suspect, etc. And yet the church understood that creating a space for young people to have an environment to do this was more significant to our own faith formation, and for them to work with us in that process as part of a broader discipleship subculture that we're willing to live with the loud music, potentially theologically suspect lyrics, etc., toward this larger end. And I think if leaders can think in that kind of direction, that there's a lot more to be gained, both short and long term. And it doesn't hurt to remind ourselves of when we were younger as well, and the kinds of things that our parents and grandparents' generations put up with and or encouraged or nurtured within us at that stage. And we sometimes forget that we all start somewhere. And part of our roles and responsibilities, theologically and sociologically, is to help that next generation to flourish. And I think it is a marker of great maturity, individually and collectively, when churches can do that. And I know that sounds harsh then to those who are unwilling to do that, but I think it's a great call that is very much needed within this day and age, where we've seen diminishing rates of religious involvement, et cetera. Like, it's all unfolding before our eyes. And this is one of the tangible responses that churches can take in response to that.
That's such a good reminder. Thanks, Joel, for that. Yeah. Natasha, let's come back to you and just maybe just ask, maybe the next question would just be around a comment about what you found as gold, and maybe just get Joel to dig a little deeper on that as well. But we'll start off with you.
Okay. I loved your analogy on the jam. Like, that whole thing, Dan and I even were texting back and forth saying, oh my goodness, this is so good. Like, so I want you to say that again, because I really think that was so beneficial, especially as a next generation pastor, thinking about how I'm leading these children and teens in my church. How do we teach them to discern well? Like, what are some key things that we need to be picking up on and like really reminding ourselves of in order to help them to discern well when they have so many choices in front of them?
Yeah, such a great question. So, yes, this JAM experiment, again, for those who maybe haven't heard of this before, social psychology study. In group 1, there are 12 different types of JAM, and participants are tasting all of them and then identifying the one that they like the most. Group 2, they are given 3 jams and they do likewise. And what they discovered was that those in group 2 that only had 3 jams found the decision process much simpler, and they were more confident in their decision relative to those with 12 jams. And the key takeaway was that the more choice you have, the more difficult it is to make that decision, and the more likely you are to regret that decision. Now we think about this in the context of young people today, where choice is deeply valued. It is socialized within the home and schools and social media, etc., where you have so many choices. What do I want to be when I grow up? What school should I go to? Who should I marry? Should I even marry? Should I have children? How should I spend my money? All of these choices have many different outcomes, kind of like a choose your own adventure. And what happens when you have so many choices is you're more prone to then second guess yourself. Like, did I go to the right school? Have I picked the right career? This is a question people are asking me during the pandemic right now. All right. Is there a pandemic-proof career that I should have selected, and should I change? Did I marry the right person? Or should I have married a different person? These are the questions that actually plague individuals. And so there's an opportunity here to help young people to discern well. Well, what does that look like in tangible terms? Well, part of it is to actually just lay out the options with young people and talk about, okay, so when I meet with prospective students, for example, who are looking to come to Ambrose, okay, what do you want to be when you grow up? And let's just start with that to start narrowing it down and say, okay, if that's the goal, that's the desired outcome, what are some other things that are important to you? Like, do you want to live near family, for example? Do you want to live in a rural or urban community? Do you want to be in a larger context or smaller context? So you begin to ask questions, ones that we don't necessarily need to answer for them, but just the act of asking a question and having a young person talk through that is very helpful and instructive for them to begin to narrow in. It also empowers them. It gives them voice within the process, which can be quite helpful. It also involves articulating some of the potential ramifications for the good or ill of whatever the decision is for young people to anticipate. And this can only come with age, right? So, if you make this decision, this is a possible outcome. Like, you just got your first paycheck and you have $100 And you know what? If you spend $60 on candy at 7-Eleven, it means you're not going to have as much money to go to this event with your friends, or to buy that item of clothing, or what have you. What we're doing then is helping students in their capacity to reason through and think through the logic of different decisions. Not that there's inherently a right or wrong decision, but like all of us have, you make decisions aware of different consequences in mind. And then within that, then you begin, as they get older and have the reasoning capabilities and capacities to think through, okay, is there a more moral response to said situation? Yes, you have agency and freedom to behave in all kinds of ways. But is there something, when we think about our theology, about our understanding of scripture, about the values that we hold to be true in our family, in our church, in our neighborhood, in our society, etc., that would help as a filter through which how you might spend your money, for example, or whatever the particular example is. But that requires intentionality. And so, I mean, I feel I'm in an unfair advantage as a university professor to work with students to really talk about these things. We look at all these sociological phenomena, but I know that these are individual human beings who are processing these things in their own lives. And then to ask questions like that, and then you just rewind the tape and you start doing that then with high school students in a kind of age appropriate way, with junior high students, with those in elementary and so forth. But it needs to start probably at a young age. So we help to shape that kind of narrative. The older they get, the harder that becomes. And so how do we have, as adult influencers, parents, teachers, youth pastors, etc., to have almost a privileged voice within the many voices that young people are hearing from their peers and so forth within the different narratives. So yeah, I don't know if that's helpful, but hopefully some tangible steps that people can take to help in the discernment process.
Colin, how about you? Something that you found as gold that will make a difference?
Really, all through it, there was all kinds of gold to be found. So really appreciate it. But I guess your starting point about the home being the greatest predictor of future faith probably struck with me, because I've been kind of banging that drum for a long time in my own context. And so I was really thrilled to hear that. The question that I find has been difficult to navigate here, especially for our volunteers. I come from a context where up until very recently, the vast majority of young people that we would minister to would be from non-churched backgrounds. And so there's a tendency, the more I kind of, like I use the term bang that drum. So the more I bang that drum about, the family being such a key predictor, and the volunteers are going, yeah, but all of our kids come from non-church families. So what chance do we stand? And so how do you work in that context where you understand that predictor of future faith is largely dependent upon home, but you have these young people for a couple hours a week?
Yeah, excellent question. And I would say, first of all, just an affirmation that for churches who find themselves in this position, I would say what a wonderful problem to have, because it reveals that churches are engaging with those in an outward direction. And clearly the teens who are already connected to a church, I presume, are inviting their friends. And so these are all very good building blocks. There is no denying sociologically that if parents are not doing these things or not enforcing these things, that the impact of what a church is doing is weakened. It doesn't mean that churches should therefore stop doing these things. It's just to hold it in a proper light and balance, that the optimal is church and family reinforcing one another. Okay. Within that, or underneath that, if you will, if you have one of those two, it's better than nothing. And so this is where a church can play a powerful role. And one of the distinct things that congregations can do is to provide as many different social points of connection and network in and through the congregation and the different networks and leaders through that church that can not altogether offset what isn't happening within the home for many of these youth. But the more of these tentacles or connections connection points that we can provide, the better. And so that might involve, like, our youth gathers every Friday night. And so this is one point of contact. Maybe they do actually attend services on Sunday. And this is where churches who think in an intergenerational way, where youth are actively involved and maybe even have leadership roles and capacities there, that this provides another point of connection. Maybe there's youth leaders, mentors, etc., who provide some more one-on-one type of mentorship that happens beyond the larger gatherings that occur on a couple times a week. Maybe in our cultivation of leaders with, say, senior leaders within our high school, like grade 11 or 12 leaders, who are taking a more active role in nurturing those in grade 7, 8, 9, or 10, and who come alongside them. And so what you see here then are a variety of different social networks that connect a person to that group. And then in and through that, a number of the beliefs and practices that are embraced within those social environments have a much greater likelihood of taking deeper root for those individuals. So this certainly isn't a claim that churches should just stop doing these things or that what they're doing isn't effective. We can still counteract the absence of something within the home. And this underscores a key idea in sociology of religion, that personal relationships are the main driver for people's beliefs and practices and affinity to religious groups. In other words, the more socially connected we are in a religious community, the more likely we are to embrace the values and attitudes and behaviors of that group. And so this is where a youth group in that particular context can actually provide multiple social outlets that don't disregard what's happening in the family. And that's important to pay attention to, right? There's different authority structures too with parents and children, but can provide all of these other outlets that might have a meaningful runway for a young person entering into their young adult years and thereafter.
Thanks for that question, Colin. Laura.
I love how you talked about listening well. So listening to young people. And you mentioned, when you take the time to listen, you build rapport and you build trust and ownership. I just wondered if you could give, some practical examples of what that can look like in a church context.
Yeah, I can give a number of examples. So one, and when I share examples, this is never a premise with like, do these things and your church will sort of flourish in all these ways. They're just examples and you take them for what they are. But so some churches will create more of an interactive space in their Sunday morning gatherings. So like a preacher might preach for a shorter period of time and then people might text questions in. And I know as I've moderated some of these in different contexts that typically it's younger people who are texting questions in based on the scripture they've just heard and may even preface that with some kind of personal experience. Some will move away from texting and just have like a microphone and good old school actual conversation and asking a question that way. And so I think this can create spaces. I think some churches have created places to host, in sociology, we call them like focus groups, a bit more of a technical term, but you just host a space where a leader just wants to listen to young people on a series of set questions. And it might be, what do you love about this church most? Where would you love to see our church in 5 years from now, or 3 years from now, or 1 year from now? Or where would you like to see our youth group? And questions like that, where the leader's sole task is to just document the findings. That is what people say. It's not to provide a defense in response to anything that's said. It's not to add on to that, but it's just to be quiet and to listen and to document and to give the floor. I think this can be really helpful for young people to feel like they're heard. And that's a starting point for many young people, that there is a sense that we're not heard. And so where does that happen? And might that actually happen in a church-wide context? It's not just within like a youth leader sitting down with youth, but maybe it's on a Sunday morning. We're going to have 3 teens on the front and we're going to interview them and we're going to ask them some questions about, what's your experience has been like during the pandemic, and what has God been teaching you, and what do you notice among your friends and your peers? And if I'm 65 years old, I'm like, this is fantastic, hopefully, to hear about young people and their experiences, because I don't understand your world as a 15-year-old. So help me understand, help me learn a little bit more. So I think that could be really helpful. I think there's some churches that will provide intentional intergenerational opportunities that bring groups together, and where like it might be over a meal, for example. It might be in someone's home. It might be again, this is all pandemic sort of interrupted, but it might be over a potluck where you need to sit with 3 or 4 people of different generations at the table. And here's a couple questions we want you to talk about. So you're the 15-year-old and you're asking the 90-year-old what it was like to grow up in that particular era, and vice versa. What these things do is they start to break down, hopefully, some of the stereotypes people might have, the misconceptions, the myths, and lead us into some of the lived realities and experiences that hopefully can alleviate some of the fear that some might have of the other just because it's the unknown. And it might actually open up opportunities so that when a 15-year-old feels like they've been listened to by the 90-year-old, there might be a sense of like, to their youth group is like, we should go to that senior center, for example, that Miss Betty lives in, and we should help out and volunteer. And Miss Betty might reach out to some of her peers and like, we should prepare some meals for these teens who are off to do this, that, or the next thing, that it can actually foster some ongoing opportunities. And I think that's just exciting. I think on every end of the continuum, it creates opportunities to be heard, to experience life in ways that honor one another and where dignity is cherished among all. And I think these are great values.
And Dan.
Yeah, thanks so much. I guess for me, like as I'm listening to the content, I'm coming at it both through the lens of being a pastoral leader, but also as a parent of preteen kids. And so as I think about my own preteens and getting them involved in church and developing those relationships, I was just really struck by your comment that said like everything grows out of relationship. And you're pushing back against that narrative that says, we need to have like the flashy band, we need to have the youth specialist working in our church and everything like that, but just to be able to build those relationships. And so kind of switching gears and looking at it more from a parent perspective, what could I, as a parent of preteens, do to help foster those kind of relationships within my local congregation?
Yeah, I think the first thing is just take a meaningful interest in your child's life. It's interested in research on young people and cell phones. Right? There's a longstanding critique about young people who are always on their cell phones when they're at the dinner table. And yet you do research with young people, and most of them will complain that actually this is what mom and dad are doing, and we wish they would put their phones away and just engage us in conversation. So I'm not here to place blame on one or the other, but it's actually creating a culture then that within our family, we value these times together so that we are engaging with one another on the topics at hand. And so maybe that's at dinner, maybe it's in other times. So some families will just take a technology timeout, whatever that looks like, and they have kind of shared social norms. And again, parents ought to rule the roost on this. So how you frame that and lay it is really important. I think second is just asking questions about their experiences of, how was school today? How was your time with your friends or practice and so forth? And I mean, every child is different. Some will be more talkative and receptive to that than not, but constantly creating the spaces for that are key, that demonstrate a genuine care and love and desire to know and to invest in their child's life, I think can be really important. I think asking questions about the interests that they are taking up, like, what are you enjoying in school? What animates you or excites you? Or what are the things that frustrate you can be important, because it helps to probably focus at a young age the kinds of interests that are emerging and how you might fan the flame of those things in different ways. Getting to know their friends, having them into the home as much as possible. It's especially for those who are concerned about who their children are hanging out with. What better place than to have them at least hanging out under your own roof, and so you know what's going on, or you think you know what's going on. Like these kinds of things, it creates familiarity so that hopefully this is a safe place that your your children's friends can come to, and it shows your children that you're taking a vested interest in what is presumably at that stage of life among the most important things to them, their peers, and creating opportunities there, and within reason, if it's plausible to do so, to get to know their friends' parents. Like you create these different networks that can create a stronger social environment for children to feel safe and welcomed and cared for, etc. Maybe the last thing, I'm sure there's a long list that others could say, and I'm not a psychologist, I'm a sociologist, so we look at different things in different ways, but I think there are opportunities to lean into the concerns that they have and to ask the questions about the concerns they have and keep those dialogue channels open, and in ways that are not necessarily coming down hard on children. So for example, if they come home from school and they hold a particular view on a moral issue that you vehemently disagree with, you still may disagree with and have reasons for why they should think differently, but to not necessarily come down hard on them, like, I can't believe you think that, and how on earth could you do that? Because that runs the risk of potentially alienating that key social relationship that you have with your child. And so that's where that dialogue piece comes in. So tell me more why you think whatever it is you think about gender, sexuality, the environment, race, fill in the topic, and try to even understand their perspective. You may not understand in the end or may not agree, and those are fine. But the process, I think, can be as significant to maintaining warm relationships over the long term. So those are some things I would suggest. And I qualify this as I don't have children, I'm not a parent. So I just study data. This is what the best data suggests. And I know very well it's different in real life with real children on the ground. So you can use that as one big disclaimer.
Joel, thank you so much for taking time. This has been so good. And I think it was, as Colin said, there's a lot of gold in what you not only shared in the masterclass session with us, but again, this has just been rich and full of nuggets that we can take and think and ponder and just chew on. And so for those of you who have been listening to this, we're grateful for your time in doing so. And we look forward to sharing with you in another masterclass soon. Thanks, John.